off in this cooler day to come and listen to our talk about Waterworks. I would like to introduce, first of all, I'm going to read the topic because it's complex, and I tried to fit it all on the board and ran out of room, the board that goes in the parking lot. But we're talking about Waterworks, a history of the local water supply, 1819 to 2016, a drama unfolding in 2 acts. And the first act, Steve Thompson will tell us about. And Steve is a member of the board here. He's been on the board for about 4 years, I think, and he is an archaeologist and principal at Rivanna Archaeological Services. And he has been a part of archaeological investigations within the old part of the university, the academical village. So his subject will be the earliest centralized water supply system for that area, which was also one of the earliest in the whole Atlantic coastal area. So we will learn about that. And then Dede Smith, who is also deeply associated with Ivy Creek Metro area. She was director here 1993 to 2007, and was one of the people who really was responsible for getting this particular building that we're all sitting in built. She founded the Citizens for a Sustainable Water Plan and advocated for preservation of the Ragged Mountain Natural Area and restoration of the South Fork Rivanna Reservoir. So during that development, she was researching the water supply and the history of our community water supply. So that's the second part of this story. And when we're all finished, we have refreshments over there, and we have a pitcher of beautiful local water. So I hope you will all appreciate that all this is about, really our being able to drink water, our being able to get water, our being able to bathe in water and wash in water, and the fact that it is safe to drink it, and we can not worry about cholera and all of the other things. So this has been a really important journey for this community, and I think for every community in the area, and still is, which you are clearly aware of when you read the newspapers about Flint, Michigan, and things like that. So thank you very much. Steve?
Thank you very much, Lois. And I would be remiss if I did not thank also at the beginning the University of Virginia, which for 12 or 15 years now has sponsored an enormous amount of archaeology within the Central Brands Historic District. And much of what I will talk about, everything we'll talk about today, really has come out of work that we've done there. We've been very fortunate in my company, Rivanna Archaeological Services, to be the go-to archaeologists for the University of Virginia for more than 15 years now. So the story begins, the first act, with an immediate mistake. It really begins in 1817. 1817 is the year that Thomas Jefferson and a couple of members of the Board of Visitors toured some land west of Charlottesville, made recommendations to the full board for the purchase of land, and the board approved it. And in fact, in 1817, 2 tracts of land about a mile west of Charlottesville were purchased for the University of Virginia. Hopefully you can see this. Charlottesville, very small area, founded about 55 years earlier. And then these 2 tracts outlined in orange, both of them part of what had been James Monroe's lower plantation, a large property of maybe 500 or 600 acres. Monroe no longer owned it. It had passed through a couple of owners. In the interim, the gentleman who sold the land, a man named John Perry, was somebody known by Jefferson. He was a carpenter who had worked at Monticello. The story goes, they looked at several properties. The other 2 owners were offering land at $17 an acre. John Perry offered his land at $12 an acre for reasons that will very quickly become understood. John Perry was playing the long game. So, just a few things, I guess, to point out. The site, as I said, the part would occupy, or that the academical village would come to be built on was an old abandoned agricultural field, described as an old plowed out field. Another 150 acres surrounding what quickly became known as Mount Jefferson. We call it now O Hill, or Observatory Hill. The land in between would eventually get purchased by the university, but it was not part of the original purchase. We have here Moore's Creek. Up here we have Meadow Creek, which winds its way. You can sort of miss it here because it's actually all undergrounded through Barrett's Road. It actually came out around Menagin and then ran up and had its headwaters on Mount Jefferson, Observatory Hill. The road, Old Three Notch Road, ran along the upland divide between those two watersheds from Charlottesville past Monroe Hill, or Monroe's Plantation, and of course out west of the mountains and across. Very quickly, I know most of you, I'm sure, know the University of Virginia and its original layout, but just a quick reminder, a series of pavilions down both sides of this central expanse known as the lawn. They're numbered, odd numbers on the west, even numbers on the east. To the outside is another range of buildings known creatively as the East Range and the West Range. And those have buildings, larger buildings interspersed known as hotels. That's where the students who occupy these load rooms, both on the lawn and on the ranges, received their meals. The hotels were operated by individuals who had contracts with the university. Their job was to essentially take care of the students, feed them, but also everything else that they needed. Small building here that most people don't know about, the Anatomical Theater, was destroyed in the 1940s to build Alderman Library, and then the original buildings of Monroe's Plantation, which stand in largely modified fashion, but still in the area known as Monroe Hill, in the Central Grounds Historic District. Construction began immediately after the purchase. Pavilion 7, cornerstone was laid in a very elaborate Masonic ceremony in October of 1817. The following year, construction began in earnest on all the buildings. John Perry, who remember, sold the land, participated in the cornerstone ceremony, participated in the construction of Pavilion 7. He was a builder, a carpenter, also a brick mason, also a manager. He actually participated in the construction of every building, every pavilion, every hotel, and the rotunda. In 1818, John Perry purchased hydraulic mills, located just over the hill here where Ivy Creek comes into the Rivanna River. Reportedly capable of producing 100,000 board feet a year. John Perry sold land to the University of Virginia. He sold lumber to the University of Virginia. He sold his skills to the University of Virginia. He earned more money than any other craftsman involved in construction in the University of Virginia that we know about. He became an extremely wealthy man through the University of Virginia, which is why he could afford to sell the land at somewhat discounted cost. So during that just the beginning of that first year of construction, the Board of Visitors met. They approved this plan, proposition to cover the buildings with tin. This was a well-known design by Jefferson. It was elaborate tin shingles, and also approved the plan for bringing water by wooden pipes from the neighboring highlands. Jefferson had thought about this at Monticello. He had a great problem getting water to Monticello on the top of the hill. He claimed that the University of Virginia was a well-watered place, but in fact, John Perry, in that first sale, very cleverly did not sell any of the springs or wells to the University of Virginia. He kept those for himself. Also in 1819, John Perry, along with another builder, James Dinsmore, conducted a survey from what was known as the Doric Pavilion, Pavilion 7, all the way up to a series of springs that are in the headwaters of Ivy Creek on the east flank of Mount Jefferson, Hill. and they began making plans for somehow getting this water to the university. 1822, this plan, that's an iconic plan of the university, ground plan, known as the Maverick Plan after its engraver, Peter Maverick, was published. It was essentially a promotional literature for the university, which was not yet open. It showed this beautiful design on the back. It had a description of how it would all work, and it included the passage that water was delivered, fresh mountain water was delivered to fountains behind the houses. None of this was in operation at the time. There were a couple of cisterns indicated on the plan, 2 of them here by larger circles. They're not labeled. We know them to be cisterns. These things, smaller circles, we think may have been wells, but we don't know. The university began installing the system of wooden water pipes in 1819, 1820. It was not an unknown system to bore out logs, 15 to 20 feet long, to turn them into pipes. It was being done in other places. Lynchburg had a very rudimentary wooden piped water supply system. The town of Philadelphia had a very elaborate system which ran water from a huge rotunda. It pumped water up out of the Schuylkill River by steam engine into tanks, elevated tanks, and then fed the town by gravity through wooden pipes. New York City had received its water through wooden pipes at the time. But for the most part, in central Virginia, nobody really knew how to do this. They put together a system, they buried the pipes, they ran them to the university. And it kind of worked, but not really. Within 2 years, it was being described by the proctor of the university, a man named Arthur Brockenbrough, as a defective arrangement. The pipes tended to leak. They really had to be wet to sort of the joins to seal well. They had to have a steady supply. None of these things seemed to work particularly well at the university. Brockenbrough made a series of recommendations. While the rotunda was under construction, he suggested putting tanks in the attic. How to get the water there, he did not suggest. He suggested building a large reservoir on O Hill. He wanted to connect hydrants along this line so that you could force water through by gravity through hoses to put out fires. None of these things were done. Brockenbrough, for a number of years, struggled mightily with the Board of Visitors trying to get things done. In this letter to Jefferson, he did tell us, though, that in 1824 there were 2 cisterns and there were several pumps and wells that were in construction or in operation. So the water was getting to these 2 cisterns, the 2 that I showed you on the map, but the system was considered defective. Another problem, as I mentioned, was that the university owned this land. They had purchased the land adjacent, containing Monroe's old plantation house, but they didn't own the land in between. Jefferson in 1825 wrote to the Board of Visitors pointing out the fact that they didn't own the water supply. The springs were on land that were owned still by John Perry, and the pipes ran across land that was owned by John Perry. And he recommended that the university purchase this, which did happen. I seem to be skipping things. For Arthur Brockenbrough, he was the only employee of the University of Virginia. He was responsible for everything. He was responsible for maintaining contracts with all the builders, for maintaining relations with the Board of Visitors, for maintaining relations with Thomas Jefferson, for making sure that everybody did what needed to be done, and for solving all of the problems that really were never spelled out. For him, the water supply was all about protecting the buildings. People would find something to drink one place or another, but if the buildings caught fire, if one of them caught fire, because so many of them were connected, the fear was that the fire would spread from one to another to another to another. He did some research. He wrote to a man named Charles Sellers in Philadelphia. He inquired of his company about fire engines and ended up purchasing a state-of-the-art engine in 1828, the Hydraulian. There is a local Charlottesville pier now, manufactured on Preston Avenue, called the Hydraulian Red. fire engine ready. It's named after this device. It required only 20 people to operate. It had pumps, each requiring 8 people to work on both sides. It was really just a big tank, a big bathtub on wheels with a hose coming out of it. You can see the guy with the hose in the door of the burning building. You roll it up to your water source, a few people try to fill the tank, and then the people manning the pump, pump and pump and pump and pump, and one person holds the end and extinguishes the flame. That was the idea. They purchased this. At the same time that they got money to purchase this, they also got money to install a new wooden pipe supply system. Everything was seeming to work reasonably well. The year was 1828. The university had been open to students for 3 years. They admitted their first 68 students in 1825. There were probably about a total of 100 people, maybe 125 living in the academical village, between students, faculty, the faculty's families, the hotel keepers, their families, and then the enslaved peoples attached to both the households of the hotels and to the faculty. This same year, 1828, 1829, the university was struck by its first typhoid fever epidemic. Records show that about 17 people, 17 students, and 4 other people at the university contracted the disease. 4 died. 2 students died. The brother of a faculty member died. The 4th person, perhaps a slave, we don't know, died because of typhoid. It's a waterborne disease for the most part. It was understood at the time, not in terms of its bacterial origins. This has been described as the age of miasmas. The disease was thought to be associated with poor ventilation, dampness, noxious odors of various sorts. Nobody quite knew, but it was sort of bad air and malaria that caused you to get things like this, these fevers that in many cases killed.
What was the hose made of?
The hose, it was made of canvas. It was made of canvas and it had brass couplings. It seemed to be very heavy. It came in lengths. The whole system had to be stored somehow. Brockenbrough, once he got the hydraulium, he pulled it up to the cistern beside Pavilion 5, and he carried the hose up onto the terrace. As you know, the pavilions on the lawn are connected by terraces that run above the student rooms. And he got the hose up on that. He had real trouble getting the tank of the hydraulium filled from the cistern. So the one pump that was on top of the cistern wasn't suitable. He recommended cutting a trap door into the top so you could bucket water. But he got good water pressure. He was able to shoot the stream of water over Pavilion 9. He then recommended that they make more purchases from this firm, that they buy additional hose so that they have a total length of 350 feet, and that they also buy some hydrants. This is a little stopcock that the firm Sellers and Pennick made, and that they install 3 of these along this water line, and then they'll be able to they can move the fire engine either from cistern to hydrant, but they can cover the entire university with this system. We know all of this, or think we know all of this, strictly from documentary sources. And there are no maps that talk about this, but there are, there are letters and there are records of things being purchased and things being recommended and bits and pieces. What we do know archaeologically is there's a cistern. This is below one of the dormitory rooms on the east side of the lawn in the basement space. I think you can see the curving wall. We have a letter written by the chair of the faculty, who lived just down the lawn in Pavilion 10, to the Board of Visitors, saying that the proctor, Mr. Brockenbrough, who had already begun constructing the cistern underneath the room, had come and asked for permission. And the chairman said, I don't think it's really wise, but clearly it was constructed. We have several archaeological finds on spots highlighted here that have been made over the years These are all iron couplings that by which the wooden pipes were joined together. They're rings of iron. One is 5 inches in diameter. The other two are 4 inches in diameter. They have a, I don't know if you can really see it, but there's sort of a ridge around the center. These things seem to have been driven into the end of the board log, and then the other log driven into it, so they were held together in that fashion. One piece did have some wood still adhering to it. We were told by people in the Department of Forestry that it's a longleaf pine.
Wooden water pipes nailed together boards or hollowed out logs?
They were hollowed out logs. There's quite a process of cutting deciding which wood to use, cutting the wood, bringing it on site, then boring the logs, digging the trenches, and then installing the board logs and fitting them together to the source, or from the source to the place that would receive the water. This is really the first cistern that we ever discovered at the university. It was found in 2006 during utility work in the courtyard at the head of Bow Alley. The second water supply that the university put in place in the late 1820s also did not work. It did not work particularly well, and almost immediately, at least in the early 1830s, we start getting references, mentions in the Board of Visitors minutes for construction of cisterns designed specifically to capture roof runoff. And there is in fact in 1833 a recommendation that a cistern be constructed in this courtyard to capture roof runoff and to serve the households flanking. During the utility work, asphalt and the lower early 20th century pavement was peeled off. The cistern was clearly visible, the outline. It had been intentionally filled all the way down 8 feet to its base. It was about 8 feet in diameter. We don't know what its superstructure looked like, but given this size, it would have held about 3,000 gallons of water. The university, for the first quarter century, grew in terms of its population rather rapidly. From the 68 students in 1825, it had jumped to nearly 650 by the mid-1850s. Space was at a premium. Faculty were teaching classes in the pavilions. I mean, that's the way it was designed. They lived upstairs, they taught classes downstairs. But with so many students, they had really nowhere to put everybody. In the early 1850s, this building, the Robert Mills Annex, was constructed, a huge set of classrooms. Additional housing was built at Monroe Hill. More would follow along what was called Dawson's Row. This plan, done by a man named William Pratt, came to the university in 1856 as the first superintendent of buildings and grounds to sort of manage the expansion of the university, shows by the letter C, I hope you can see that, a series of cisterns in various locations around the lawn, a couple flanking the rotunda. These are all still being fed either, we assume, by the wooden pipes, or they're just capturing roof runoff. There are constant references through the 30s and 40s about the need for more cisterns, but whether they were actually built is very difficult to determine. This is just a shot from the east showing you what the annex looked like. It was a huge construction. The recent renovation work at the rotunda entails inserting an underground room in the east courtyard of the rotunda that extends under half the rotunda. It's a large utility room, but also a kitchen. In advance of that work, we knew from that map that I showed you and from other sources that there were cisterns flanking the rotunda, and we were hired by the university to find them, or at least the one on this side that was to be removed. Many of you probably remember the fountain that used to stand in this courtyard. It is there no longer. It turned out the cistern was underneath of that. And it was, the top of it was heavily damaged by the construction of the fountain. No record of its existence was recorded when the fountain was built in 1960. It was quite a bit bigger, about 10 feet in diameter, about 13 feet deep. It collected water strictly from roof runoff We had portions of the lines feeding into the cistern, collecting roof runoff, both from the rotunda, and then there was another line that came from the front of the wings of the rotunda, and then a drain line that ran out in that direction. The inside of the cistern was inscribed with names. This was crucial in helping us date it. It was constructed just before the annex was built. This gentleman, James W. Brand, who wrote his name probably 10 times on the inside of the cistern, was the son of a very well-known contractor, mason, plasterer to the university, a man named Charles Brand. James was 19 this summer and clearly was working for his father. The following year, he would be enrolled at UVA. He got his degree at UVA. He went on to the Medical College of Virginia. He became a doctor, and he relocated to Alabama, where he lived out his life. You know, when this was reported, a descendant from Alabama contacted us and said, "I know who James Brand is. He's a relative of mine." The other person, Charles Carter, we don't know who he is, but this helped us date the cistern to 1851. The next step in the university's water supply system was to swap out the wooden pipes for iron pipes. They'd been trying to do this for a number of years. There was never money. Finally, in 1856, they hired a well-known engineer named Charles Ellett, who had been involved in a number of things. The C&O Canal, the James River Canal. He was the chief engineer for the Virginia Central Railroad, building the temporary track over Rockfish Gap while Claudius Crozet was tunneling through the mountain. He came and did a survey of the university and outlying grounds, looking for water sources, trying to figure out how to get water to the university better. This was all done. The most notable feature is a pond here in red, which it didn't stand, it was sunken pretty much where McCormick Road meets University Avenue. Water flowed in these new iron pipes to this pond by a steam pump at the university, a steam engine running a pump that was installed in the portico of the annex. It pumped water from the pond to tanks in the attic of the rotunda. And from there, it gravity fed the university. This is a picture of the pond from the late 19th century. This gentleman is standing, it doesn't show up particularly well in this reproduction, but there's sort of a rocky wall there. There is another feature, underground. This is the chapel, the rotunda, the intersection with the pond over here. This is a 45-foot long, 10-foot wide brick vault that is completely underground. It appears to have been attached to one arm of this pond. Its western wall is constructed of rock. The rock is just inserted into the wall. The eastern wall facing the rotunda has an iron pipe. When we first saw it, that descended from the top of the wall and was buried in deep muck in the bottom of this thing. So this long chamber seems to have been attached to the pond. The pipe has been found in sections going all the way up to the northern end of the rotunda. The bottom of the pipe, we were able to excavate. This whole feature had been reverse engineered at some point by the university to receive stormwater. This is a terracotta pipe that pierces its wall and would take roof runoff, and it would dump it into this, and it would run out the other end. The university, when they did this huge rotunda restoration, kept this function for this thing. They took out the entire eastern wall and installed a big manhole that's capturing all the runoff from the rotunda. It still runs it into this big vault, sort of a holding chamber, and then releases it slowly into the stormwater system. But clearly this construction must have been designed and built by Charles Ellett, was designed to work the other way. This was the bottom of the pipe. This was pulling water from the. This is looking in from the east after the eastern wall is removed. That pipe hung down into this square sump or reservoir. It had the perforated copper basket on the bottom. This pipe runs all the way to the far end, comes up. This appears to be where the spring water from O Hill would emerge into this buried vault. When full, it could flow back through the stone wall, and that wall may be a crude filter. There's stone on both sides, but inside quite possibly has sand or other material, so that it had an overflow into this open-air pond, but it could also flow back and be relatively clean, and then it would be pumped from here into the rotunda tanks. Mind you, nobody was drinking this water. I mean, it was being used for cleaning, maybe for cooking, but it really wasn't the drinking supply. There are some annotations on Elliot's map, things that are drawn in very light pencil, which we think are possibly showing the lines coming out of the rotunda attic. I mean, these would be coming down the sides of the rotunda and then traveling underground to various parts of the university. The red things are hydrants that seem to be indicated. There are some cisterns, again, penciled in with the letter C. The next big stage in the university's water supply system, and I probably need to hurry because Dede is going to be here until dark. After the Civil War, a new superintendent of buildings and grounds, a man named Moses Green Payton, known as Green, best known for a map of Albemarle County that he drew. He was trained as a civil engineer at the University of Virginia. One of the first people to receive that degree. He had worked as a railroad engineer before the Civil War. He was, during the war, he fought for the Confederacy and served as an engineer in some capacity. After the war, he constructed a reservoir on Observatory Hill. If you can find Reservoir Drive, you will drive right over the dam on the way to the old nuclear reactor facility on the side of the hill. Green Payton's reservoir was sufficient to gravity feed all of the academical village. It also had a filter. The water left through a filter into iron pipe and traveled to the university. He said it was sufficient to serve the university, but they kept the steam pump, they kept the tanks in the rotunda in case of emergency, and they seemed to periodically activate it. They really, even with this system, never had enough water. This was constructed in 1869. Again, a map that was produced, this is sort of a utilities map of the university, probably produced by Green Payton. I've highlighted the water lines and other hydrants and other features, stopcocks that are shown on it. There still seems to have been water coming into the pond, which still existed. In the late 1870s, the university had yet another typhoid epidemic that occasioned more deaths. By this point, the nature of the disease was understood. It was understood that it was linked to contaminated water supplies. In this particular case, there was a well somewhere along the West Range that was being contaminated by the sewer system, such as it was. There wasn't a sewer system. There was a system of drains that consisted of, the drains were we call them brick box drains. They're just simply bricks, one on the bottom, a couple at the sides, one on the top. And there's a whole maze of these things under the university that were carrying off runoff of all kinds. They were draining privies, they were draining roofs. There was a combined system of sanitary sewerage and stormwater. And these drains they weren't watertight. Things leaked from them all the time. One clearly leaked and contaminated a well. Many people became sick. Some died. This occasioned the hiring of a man named Dennis Bowditch, a sanitary engineer, who came in, evaluated the university, installed a state-of-the-art drainage system, or sewerage system, which carried all the water, at least to the edge of the university, and then dumped it into Meadow Creek, into the headwaters of Moores Creek, into several African-American communities that were, by that point, ringing the university. But it was getting the noxious things away from the central grounds. Bowditch also said the system really needs to be flushed to work properly. The city of Charlottesville was at the time becoming increasingly interested in a centralized water supply. It had none. It was getting its water from wells, both private and public, and from springs. Bowditch was hired by the city and by the university to conduct a survey. He located, whoops, I'm still in the thunder. He located the Ragged Mountain Reservoir, recommended that that be constructed. The reservoir was built. The water supply was put in place 1886. Water was traveling from Ragged Mountain through the university and then into the city of Charlottesville. A single 10-inch diameter main was bringing the water. It got to the university first, then it went to the city. This happened every place centralized water supplies were introduced. As soon as you have it, there's not enough. Because as soon as you have it, people realize how incredible this is. And there are reports of people just leaving the water running just to watch it. I mean, it's really great. You just see it running all the time. So as soon as you have running water, you suddenly realize all the things you can do with it that you didn't do before. So as soon as it was installed, there wasn't enough water. The university, within 5 years, had installed its own dedicated 6-inch main straight from Ragged Mountain to the university, while the city kept the 10-inch main. And still there wasn't enough water. And the lack of water was evidenced in 1895 by the complete destruction of the rotunda. That year had seen, we had 1886, the first reservoir, and really the first adequate water supply, or what was thought to be an adequate water supply. In 1895, the city got its first sanitary sewer system. In between those two, both the city and the university were electrified. All of these new amenities were added. It was in fact electricity that is thought to have caused the fire. It was the lack of water pressure that led to the complete destruction of the rotunda. So, Dede?
Thank you, Steve. That was incredible, and my talk will be different because it won't have that level of certainly of scientific evidence. I'm going to cover a little bit more ground in terms of time, but it will also refer to a number of things that Steve referred to. So bear with me. A lot of you actually probably know things that I don't even know and don't express in here. And this is really just skimming the surface of a lot of the history. It's also just basically about reservoirs. I'm not going to go into the sanitary sewer system or the stormwater system at all in this. So, but I'm going to start where, basically, well, this will be an overview of the years between 1887, which you could say a little bit earlier than that, where Steve left off, to the present day, and how we went through the process of building our water supply. And in many cases, it's a water supply or it's just a reserve in case of when water runs low. But Ragged Mountain is our first one, as Steve was saying, and we'll talk about that first. Sugar Hollow Reservoir was the second reservoir that we built, and this is all the city at this point. Beaver Creek was the third one, and that was in Crozet. Again, we'll go through all this. Todier Creek, it's off my map, in Scottsville was the next one, and then South Fork was the last new reservoir to be built, although, as we now know, that we're back, circled all the way back around to Ragged Mountain as our latest venture. But we're going to start with Ragged Mountain. And just a little prehistory, the area that we're talking about is right in here. And if you look, I guess this is here's the university. You can see a little bit, I think you can see a little bit of the university in here. The railroad, you'll notice the railroad, recognize the railroads. So we're just going to follow what is now Reservoir Road out to the Mayo's property. It was originally purchased in a very large land grant by the Gooch family, I think Goochland County. And in the early 1800s, the Mayo family bought what's now basically most of what is Ragged Mountain Reservoir, and farmed it with their, in sort of as a large extended family farm. It was called Little Egypt at one point, the Gooch family, just as a little historic note. Don't really know why, but Ragged Mountain is what was the part of Little Egypt. What we know, this is a Holsinger picture. We've got some really cool early photos from Holsinger. This is actually a little bit later than when Ragged Mountain was first built. But you can see, if you can see here, you can get a sense for what the land looked like when it was first built, first bought by the city. It was largely cleared in this just small family farming, not huge plantations or anything. And the agricultural censuses do tell us a lot about certainly the late 1800s that the Mayo family grew. They grew corn, oats, and wheat. They had orchards. They had livestock. Pretty typical family farming. So in 1885, again, sort of taking off where Steve left off, the city basically condemned 150 acres of the Mayo's family's land, kicked them off of that part of the land. And in 1887, their construction of their new dam was their first dam ever, was constructed. It's, you'll recognize it if you know Ragged Mountain Natural Area from pre-New Dam days, that this is the land bridge that we used to make a circular trail. It was long and nice and thick. It had a rock base which was quarried off the land. Again, if you know Ragged Mountain Natural Area, you'll recognize that you could see the quarries where they got the rocks. It was all sort of done on site. It had this earthen buttress around it and a spillway at each end. And this is of course, the control tower for it. So it's also what we call the upper reservoir. The first reservoir was sort of this way towards what is now before. And then, as Steve was saying, and I took some of this language directly from this really great document, and I've got the documents over here from 1937, when somebody wrote sort of what we often use as the early history of the water supply. For a few years, Charlottesville was just, thrilled. They had lots of water. In 1888, the city fathers removed the charge of water for bathtubs. Now, to mind you, they didn't have meters, so you were charged by the bathtub. And of course, that was very popular. And then it didn't, but they started running out of water pretty quickly, just as Steve gave a great explanation of it. But they also realized it was leaking. It wasn't really very tight. So in 1892, just really not even 10 years after it was built, 5 years after it was built, they built a little pond downstream where it was draining. And Tom Darrow was talking about how it lasted for a long time and remembers the pond, not from then obviously, but, and they caught a lot of the water, then used steam pumps, again, a lot of the same technology, and pumped it back up to Ragged Mountain. And again, if you go in the Department of Forestry land, you can find some remnants of these things. But they pretty much knew that this wasn't going to last long. And so, a few dry seasons later, and the population's increasing, and technology's increasing. There's lots of changes going on. So pretty much they were planning on expanding that reservoir, and they bought the rest of Mayo's land and a little bit of Houchin's land to expand. At this point, everybody's kicked off. They're just kicked off. Which is fascinating, and it's part of actually the themes of this talk, is what did they anticipate? They bought a lot of land, and they really anticipated protecting the water supply, because they made a deliberate effort to get everybody off of the land. So this is their new These are, again, all these Holsinger pictures. They're just amazing. They're all in special collections. This was the lower dam, and it was concrete. You can imagine how, you know, you compare that to the land bridge. Just this was really big technology here, and all these white men are very proud of this dam. Of course, this is where the water will fill up. A little bit later, the concrete dam actually wasn't perfect, because in 1934 they did have to put in earthen buttress, like in the original dam, up against it so that it would stay upright. So here we are. I just wanted to show you this. Again, here's and this is Peyton's map. Again, going back to Steve's talk, this is Peyton's 1874 map. And again, this was where the city bought land. And this is basically where the reservoir was put in. And again, note that they look at the land that was bought for, this is almost the entire watershed of Ragged Mountain, which is interesting. Not quite, but almost. And here, of course, now in this modern map, we have 64 having been built right by their water supply. So, but we'll get to the 60s. The 60s were an interesting time. And I just want to note that there were, in the newest plan, it is said of the new plan, features include the preservation of architectural history, but it's the history part, because there were 4 sites eligible for the National Register that actually had to go as part of the new plan, including the land. This is the land bridge and the control tower. This was a view from the upper dam. But this was interesting because, again, at this point, one of the things that happened when they built the new dam, the 1904 dam or 1908 dam, was they couldn't fill it. What they didn't anticipate is the watershed, which is very small, and the streams that run into it, which are very small too, there wasn't enough inflow. So they knew they were going to have to do something. They started running out of water again pretty quickly. So they did, the council commissioned this, those are not my words, thorough and exhaustive. the words of this reference that I have over on the table. A thorough and exhaustive study of the raw water sources in the community. Where can we go from here? And this is interesting because it comes back really to kind of haunt us later. The Rivanna River was turbid. Turbid really refers to the sediment. It's very silty. It was too expensive. This is 1921, they're saying. It's too expensive because you got to chemically treat it and you got to pump the water. Buck Mountain definitely wasn't big enough, and it's pretty far away, but pretty clean, but it's got its few fatal flaws. Ivy Creek is basically the same problem as Rivanna River. Voorhees and Moores Creek are the urban ones where the sewage is going into. They're just a mess. They still are. And the Meachams is just like the Rivanna, very silty and too far away. Mormons was, their words, unquestionably superior. I say that's the Mary Poppins, was practically perfect in every way. So that's where they went to the Mormons, and the first solution they had was to build a very small dam. It's 3 feet tall at the junction of the south and north forks of the Mormons River, and to build to install a 13-mile cast iron pipe that's run by gravity down to the Ragged Mountain Reservoir. That pipe is the one still in use. So this is in 1925. It actually worked really well. It could hold it could pump 2.5 million gallons of water. I mean, today that pipe is only capable of maybe 3.5 million gallons. So it actually worked pretty well, but they knew this was a temporary solution. And interestingly, they also were worried enough about getting enough water that they put this pump on the Meachams that kind of was, the pipe and the Meachams go very close to each other, could have been tied in to the 13-mile pipe that keeps resurrecting itself, but it's never been used. But we hear about it again, even in our recent discussions. here's just a picture. That is the water running in from the Mormons at the Ragged Mountain Natural Area. It was not, the pipe didn't go all the way anymore down to the water. Wasn't a very good solution. But, as I say, they knew they were going to need more water. So, again, knowing the Mormons is the place to go for clean water, they started buying land. The city started. And this is all city. This is the only city. Went up and bought a whole bunch of land around what would become the reservoir, but it was just the Mormons at that time. Interestingly, they made it, there's a note in the historical documents that they thought about, there were families living on this land, and they investigated whether they needed to kick them off, like they did the Mayos, and they didn't. They didn't feel that the impact, but they talked about it. They talked about what was happening on the land next to what would be their future reservoir, and whether it would impact water quality. And they didn't, but in the 1920s, if you think about what's happening, the Shenandoah National Park is coming in, and which surrounds this. And they went ahead and kicked people off. It's a big, of course, it was a big issue, and it's now coming to the fore again. So in the end, this land ended up with very few people by the time they built the reservoir. Now, they didn't build the reservoir right away. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Because a whole bunch of stuff happened. The Depression happened. There's actually a terrible drought about this time as well. Europe was reminding me. And then, of course, World War II. But look, 1946, right after the war, they go ahead. And these are really great pictures. This comes from an article in the, I think it must have been the Crozet Gazette, that's online, if you want to find it, some really good pictures. But this is the Sugar Hollow Dam being built. It actually, well, whatever, it was quite a feat at the time. This is a great picture. So it had 339 million gallons. It's not even quite as much as Ragged Mountain had, but it is still connected to the Ragged Mountain Reservoir with that 13-mile gravity-fed pipeline. Many of you will probably remember the 1995 flood. I think it must have been Hurricane Fran that just devastated Sugar Hollow. I mean, it just cut Sugar Hollow off and just wreaked havoc on the whole rest of the dam. It filled in a whole bunch of the reservoir, so it lost capacity. Roads, families, everything. So a little while later, they actually put an inflatable bladder. That was sort of the last improvement to that dam. I love this picture because this is what watershed protection looks like. And we'll see later what water protection doesn't look like. But you really can't get a lot of it. So, then the 60s happened. I like to say it's the decade of damming dirty water. We built so many dams in the 1960s on almost all of the sources that we were told not to. So we had, again, let's review, Rivanna River, Buck Mountain, Heavy Creek, Murray's and Wood Beachums. And of course, none of this stuff got better. It only got worse in the 60s. I mean, the 60s was just a mess. I mean, across the nation, we're just soiling our nests so badly. It's the decade of the Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I mean, there's so much pollution out there. But it can stop us. In 1964, interestingly, again, remember up to this point, the whole water supply thing is being done by the city, because the city is the provider of water. It's mostly for city residents in the growing urban ring, and of course the city's still annexing at this point. But the county gets involved in water supply for their own purposes. They've got Crozet, they've got industry coming into Crozet, and so Beaver Creek was a county separate effort, so completely separate from the city's efforts. And they start planning along with the Soil Conservation Service, and they often are building dams for other reasons as well, including flood control and other ways. But they would just thinking ahead and saying, okay, well, we might need some reserves, so we're going to build Beaver Creek. But Beaver Creek is basically the Meachams. You know, it's the same watershed. It's connected. You know, it was that same kind of decision. And then actually, Albemarle County Service Authority was actually created at that point, which is still a major player. And then they built Todier Creek Reservoir in the Scottsville area. I was at a Rivanna meeting recently, Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority meeting, where they referred to Todier Creek Reservoir as an emergency-only reservoir because it's so dirty. But and then they were thinking of expanding yet again. And this is the decade that they bought 570 acres along Prairie Creek, thinking that would be a reservoir. And it actually, in this case, they also, Chris Green actually played into the water supply too. But anyway, so the Albemarle County is independently doing all this stuff. Here's Beaver Creek. This is interesting, and I pulled these off the Albemarle County's GIS, which is a fantastic service. The information is so good. This is what Albemarle County owns around Beaver Creek. You notice the difference between this and those other maps is that you just don't, they're really buying what they need for expansion, but not a lot more outside of it for protection. You know, a lot of these are very large watersheds too. It's not like they could buy a lot of the watershed. And that's a modern map. But let's think about the water resources, because it's going to come up again. So now we've got basically the Meachams watershed dam, because the cities now, independently of the county, is thinking of their next move. And they go to the top of the do not dam list, to the Rivanna. And this is what the city bought in 1962. The city bought all this land, 400 feet up from the Rivanna River and Ivy Creek, up to a point, for about 10 miles on both sides to create their next reservoir. And this is interesting because here's the dam here, and it ends, the reservoir ends about here, but they own, they still do. This is interesting. They still own, the city does, all this land along the Rivanna River. And then, this is Ivy Creek right here. For some reason it didn't pop up on the, yes, because it's South Park. That's Peninsula Trail. In 1966, the Rivanna River Reservoir is created. It's finally going to start filling up. Within a few years, it's basically dead. It's the eutrophication of the reservoir just capturing all these nutrients. It's causing algae blooms. That's depleting the reservoir of oxygen and all the other things that happen. They started calling in, and it was a few years later that it was actually Beth conducted a study for EPA that said most of that pollution was coming from the beaches. And which makes sense, because you got the Mormons and the beaches coming together to create the Rivanna. There's like a ton of these articles. And interestingly, the reason we have all these newspaper articles about this is this was a major factor in the creation of Ivy Creek Natural Area, to protect this reservoir that they realized that they blew. Anyway, so actually there was talk of decommissioning the South Fork Rivanna Reservoir. Where are we going to go next? Because this isn't going to last. And then it took a few decades. They at least got it somewhat under control, but it's never been a clean reservoir. It's and I just thought you might, at this point, like to see what it looks like when a river is dammed, which is kind of interesting. And this is all from Ivy Creek. So again, here's Ivy Creek, and here's your peninsula trail right there. So here's Ivy Creek, comes around here, and it goes into the Rivanna. This is the Rivanna, right in here. And what's kind of particularly cool about it, we are right there. Here's the farm. You can see how clear it is. What's interesting, back to Steve's talk, this is where the hydraulic mill, so this is Perry's hydraulic mill, was right here. It was an extremely important mill. After Perry sold it, after UVA was built, he immediately sold it to the Burnley and Orledge families, and it became quite the center of this whole farming area for all of the 19th century. And then after the Civil War, so after 1865, to about 1900, it became a very important village for the growing African-American landowners, including Hucar. So it was a very important site. Now, once the railroads came in, a lot of these mills just disappeared and the villages with them. But it was called hydraulic, in case you wonder where the hydraulic road name came from. It's this village. And interestingly, I won't go on this too long, but so the road came down here. This is the boat launch now. To go into the reservoir, came across Ivy Creek and then back over to the Rivanna and then back up here. That was the road system. And the village, if you go over the Woodlands Bridge, the village was right there. But anyway, so here's 1966. This is the first year of the reservoir. So you can still see the original bridge. But now they built the Woodlands Bridge and the Earlysville Bridge here. So this is 66. By 74, this is when the reservoir is pretty much dead. But you've got still, so those other bridges, those other bridges are gone. By 80, the other problem with the Rivanna was getting all this pollution from the Meacham's watershed. But if you remember the list, it said turbidity, sediment. And so what's really interesting about these is you start seeing the sediment coming in. Here's Ivy Creek again. And you're getting all this sedimentation. You can see it in these aerials. These are just the aerials that exist. And really, look, this is completely closed. Now, this is the last one I have, but Ivy Creek's just closed back in, and it's just a mess, but there it is. Okay, 1970s. So we have this county in the 1960s building a bunch of stuff and planning to build more. And we've got the city building their new reservoir that's being polluted by the county. And the county and the city, in case you thought this was a new thing, are fighting like cats and dogs. I mean, it's famous. they're just at each other's throats. Who's going to pay for what? Whose problem is whose? Da-da-da-da-da. And it's just recapping all the independent things that they're doing. So in 1972, the federal and the state government get fed up. And I'm not making this up, I mean, this is written down. And they say, and because the city and county also are competing for the same money to do things that really are interconnected, that they're really all one system. And so basically the state control board said, nobody's getting any money until you guys figure this out. You have to cooperate or nobody's getting anything. And so in 72, and actually by 73, they came together and created the Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority. That's how we got the Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority. It was forced on them, whole thing. But, the four-party agreement was signed at that point. So with the Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority, so we begin what we always have even recently called the Community Water Plan, but it really began in the 70s. Because just like Steve was saying, almost as soon as you build a reservoir, they start planning for the next one. And these are all the list of all the consultants over the years who have been hired to look for alternatives, and there's always the same alternatives. I mean, that's the really amazing thing. Nobody really comes up. They kind of frame it differently, but there were about 32, always about 32, and but interestingly, early on, there were 3 that were pulled out as the top contenders: Buck Mountain, James River, and expanding the South Fork. And in about by 82, they were saying, oh, it's too expensive to go to do those other things, so go to Buck Mountain. So, and here's a list. This is a list of some of the alternatives. I have in bold the ones that just always rose to the top. So dredging South Fork, adding bladders. And in the years I was director there, that was the big threat, because they were going to raise the South Fork Rivanna Reservoir and flood out our trails. I mean, that lasted actually a long time. Conversion of Ragged Mountain, that's kind of what we ended up with. Mountain and James River. So those are always the ones that rose to the top. So do you all remember with the big Squat Mountain fight? This is when I first came to town, and I remember it. I mean, it was just a huge community crisis that they were going to build a reservoir. It was suggested that they build a reservoir. And again, they were warned in 1921. Don't go to Buck Mountain. And at the time, it was because it was too small. And it was really far away. Those were the warnings. But, and the city and county started fighting again about who was going to pay for it, and et cetera, et cetera. But 1,800 acres were purchased. Rivanna Water Sewer Authority owns 1,800 acres in the Buck Mountain Reservoir area. It was actually recently used for the mitigation of the damage to the Ragged Mountain. But it's a pretty decent piece of property. Again, it sort of looks like they bought enough to at least protect the water somewhat. Anyway, but interestingly, so that wasn't, of course, the end of the thing that was well known, the end of the community water fight. So the water plan fight. Over this course, something really, really big happened, but it was never really acknowledged. And that was in 1992 when the federal government passed the Energy Policy Act that put restrictions on water use. And one of the biggies, and I have it bold, is because they required low-flow toilets, 1.6 gallons. Remember, typically, our toilets were 5 gallons. And that's almost an 80% reduction in what is, for a residential community like ours, a really big chunk of what we do. We flush toilets. And you think about our industry now, more so than even back then, hospitals, hotels. This was going, I mean, it was predictably going to have at least some impact. But it was never acknowledged in the community water plan, even by the consultants. I think they gave it 5%. We'll give you 5%. Which is ridiculous. But it was predicted by everybody else that we were just going to reduce, our water use was going to be reduced, and we should be planning for that. Did it play out? Yeah, it did. Actually, see, so this is, here is the predictions we used. Because they began in the 90s. And these water demand predictions began before any impact was seen with the Policy Act. And we're still going on this line. And this actually also, of course, incorporates population. Population has indeed followed their predictions. So you could use this as a population increase, but this is what our water use has done. This is the urban area. And it still is not going up, even with population increases. So we're still seeing conservation. We're still seeing impacts. I mean, I can't, show you evidence that it's the water conservation requirements, but it makes perfect sense. And particularly when you think about, if this is the predictions we're using, this is the predictions for new development too. The new development is based on high flow toilets. And water and faucets and shower heads and everything else. And there were other changes. I mean, there were others, but this is the most sort of sustainable, the biggest one that we had. Then a few other really big things happened. Again, and then I bring these up because they do impact our planning. Or they should impact our planning. Or did impact our planning. In 2002, the drought, which really started in 1999. The drought just changed everything. It changed everybody's thinking. It also changed requirements for what we had to build for, because there's a sort of a new standard for drought protection, which is really what reservoirs are about, drought protection. And also, interestingly, the Department of Health wrote to Rivanna, and I didn't bring a letter with me, but I got it, and said they had reviewed all of their community water planning process and were and this was not a nice letter either, and said what disturbed them the most is that never did they see a reference to the quality of the raw water. That the quality matters. And that, again, goes back, we knew that in the 1920s. We knew that raw quality mattered. And in all of this planning, it just wasn't brought up. And then, interestingly, that in 2004, the Nature Conservancy approached Rivanna and asked to be a partner. And they said, come on in this water planning. And that actually made a huge difference because they brought a lot of expertise, they brought a lot of power, they brought money, interestingly. But about that time, we brought in yet another study, which gave us yet the same 32 possible alternatives. And these are the ones that came, these 4, adding a bladder on South Fork, expanding South Fork, dredging, James River, the least popular always, and then a higher dam at Ragged Mountain. But in this case, this option was to fill it from the Mormons with a new pipeline. But there was immediate public opposition. And that was kind of rising to the top there, the expanding Ragged Mountain, 44 feet higher, because of the impact on the Mormons. And so it took about a year, but Rivanna came back along with the Nature Conservancy, they're both in cahoots at this point, saying, hey, okay, well, how about if we expand Ragged Mountain, but we'll fill the new pipeline from the South Fork. We'll fill it from the South Fork, and we'll take away the ones that everybody, not me, but most of the opponents thought that was great. They were just thrilled that this was going to be the solution, that we could expand Ragged Mountain, but we could also relieve the Mormons. And so that's what was passed. It was passed unanimously by everybody. Unfortunately, because Rivanna came back a couple of years later and said, but we can't afford to do that. That's sorry. It's a great plan. We're going to phase it. First, we're going to expand Ragged Mountain, and we'll fill it from the Mormons. And then we'll put the pipeline in and it was suggested about 10 years later. But since that time, the 10 years is now expanded to 25 or 35. So I always say this, I know it sounds like I'm rehashing things, but because I think it's the burning issue now in the community is whether or not that pipeline is going to be built. And one of the reasons it's not going to come anytime soon, and Rivanna has said this, they said because it's really predicated on demand. And so if you think about it, this is we're at the 10-year mark about right now. And this is what the pipeline demands. But this is where we are. So they basically said, well, when we get up there, then we'll need the pipeline. But we can all take bets about when we're going to get up there. But so in the end, and again, I say that because in the end we basically got the alternative that both Rivanna and the Nature Conservancy wanted. They both wanted raising the Ragged Mountain Dam to be filled from the Mormons. And the premise of that is that the Nature Conservancy said because we can control the flow of downstream flow to the Mormons. We can have it both. And this is a model that they very upfront said they wanted, this was their new model. They wanted to use us as an example, and they have exported this idea. And you know what? So far it's worked pretty well. I've been surprised. It's been wet. So it's a little hard to say at this point. But the idea is if you, and this is also now being talked about because of the discussion about the pipeline, if you put enough water in Ragged Mountain, it is a lot of water, then you buy yourself time between dry periods, and you don't have to take water from the Mormons. Right now, they're not taking any water from the Mormons River. They cut off the pipeline, they're taking all their water out of the reservoir. When it gets wet, they will fill it back up from the Mormons. It's a fascinating concept. I mean, I can't say that if I knew that, I might have had actually a fairly different approach to this because the South Fork's pretty dirty. But now to fill the Ragged Mountain for the South Fork would be a big deal. Anyway, so these are just a couple. I was just looking for other people's pictures of, I don't really have any. This was sort of in process. It was filling up, so because you can see this is the old new dam, 1908 dam, which is now underwater. But they did, this is what's left of it. They breached it here. They completely took out the oldest dam. And you can see the cleared land. They actually mined the dirt to build the earthen dam that they've got now. And this is now the raised dam. So that's what we got. If history repeats itself, we'll start hearing about the next water supply any day now. Because that's basically what's happened every time, is the discussion starts, because it takes a long time. And so, what will it be? I mean, interestingly, right now, so now we've got our new Ragged Mountain, we've got Sugar Hollow. The other thing worth noting is that Sugar Hollow and Ragged Mountain used to at least be two separate sources. They were connected, but you could independently get water from the Sugar Hollow. We go directly to Observatory Water Treatment Plant. That's no longer true. Sugar Hollow is only connected to the reservoir. So the only way to get water out of Sugar Hollow is through the Ragged Mountain Reservoir. So that's one system. It is literally one system now. And I'm just talking about urban now. South Fork still exists, but the plan is for it to go away. I mean, there's, I think, 200 million gallons out of 1,200, that it had originally had. That is in that, that exaggerated demand profile. So right now, the plan in the next 50 years is to have this one connected reservoir. And then actually in 2010, the ASAP, I can never remember what it stands for, identified very significant groundwater resources too, and particularly in the western, that actually could play into this integrated system that we have. So what is the future urban water supply? I say the times are changing. I would really expect that our water conservation technology link will play into this. If I had to predict, I went driverless cars, that we will stop flushing our toilets at all with potable drinking water, that will stop irrigating with potable drinking water, that we will really sort of get back almost to the very early days when you didn't, you cared a lot just about what you drink, but not so much about what you use when you don't need potable drinking water. But this is my prediction. Anyway, so that is where we are in all of this. And thank you for listening.
Question. Has anything been done at Ragged Mountain to mitigate runoff from those areas that have been cleared?
Just planting. Interestingly, so there was deliberate tree planting done to try to, anything that isn't covered, but not know in terms of what's being covered by the water. But they have found that there are sort of bare land when it's full. So they're just planting. They're just trying to make up for it. As far as I heard. It's a good question. And it's only now. It's also interesting to note that it's all it's a 40-foot high dam, but they only fill 33 feet. That was the compromise. And so there is another 11 inches it could go up in the future, if there's enough water. Jane?
Related to this a little bit. You showed the beautiful picture of the Sugar Hollow Reservoir and said in watershed. You said this is how you protect the watershed, as opposed to, and you were going to talk some more about Ragged Mountain. I would like to hear more about that.
Oh, in terms of protection.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of Ragged Mountain, actually, because the city owns almost the whole watershed, that's really kind of the most important part of protection is that, what's flowing into your reservoir. And of course, Sugar Hollow, you saw a picture of, is really the primary source for that water in there. So I think it's just important that, we protect that area personally, that, if the evidence bears out that raw water, actually, protection of your raw water matters. And this is actually, and thanks for bringing that up, and there's one other thing I didn't put in here, and very recently, the Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority commissioned a study on reservoir management. Because South Fork and Beaver Creek in particular right now are suffering severe pollution, and or nutrient pollution, and phosphorus tends to be the biggest limiting culprit, because they're seeing algal blooms. And the problem with algae blooms, as we saw back in the 70s, is it not only depletes oxygen, but algae, you can't let the algae, if it's in that kind of volume, get to the water treatment plant, because first of all, it'll gum up the system, and secondly, there's a weird trigger somewhere in this blue-green algae where it can actually produce neurological toxins. This is something this is why they closed the beaches in Florida over the 4th of July. Because that was algae, it was blue-green algae, and they worried about the toxic effects. And it's when, particularly if it's got mechanical mashing, which I guess the ocean does. But the water treatment plant can. You never sort of not quite know when the blue-green algae is going to do that.
Where is the water treatment plant?
Where's it
How do you
treated?
get to the water treatment plant for all this?
Yeah, well, in the case of South Fork, it's close by. It's not Morse Creek, that's wastewater. It's at the, yeah, but right, what's it called? Is it,
Woodward Road?
no, that's good. So it's a water treatment plant for South Fork. Now, Ragged Mountain has a separate water treatment plant on an observatory hill, and that's an old one. And I can't tell you as much about the history.
Well, how about the capacity of those two systems?
Yeah, now, so the South Fork is a greater capacity. There is in the plan, in the community water plan, to expand the observatory and to link those two water treatment plants better. It's, in theory, the whole system is integrated, but it's really not for water treatment. So there is an expansion of observatory in the plans, but it hasn't happened.
We don't want to end up like Flint, and everybody getting water that's not purified,
Exactly. And, actually the Flint situation with lead was an issue that we dealt with in 2012. And I was on council at the time when it was proposed that to deal with another kind of pollution, and this is why you cannot just say, well, we're just going to treat our polluted raw water. I mean, there's not really, you can, but it requires adding more chemicals. It requires a lot of money, and et cetera, but the Rivanna proposed in response to new standards that the EPA brought back for carbon pollution, for byproducts from carbon pollution, to add chloramine, to change chlorine to chloramines in our system, which is, it's not necessarily Flint's problem, but in Washington, D.C., created lead problems. And which is what the community came for. It was huge, it filled up Lane Auditorium. People saying, don't put chloramines in our water. Don't, because look what's happened in other old cities with pipes that leach lead when, da-da-da-da-da. So that was the big fear back in 2012. But yeah, no, I think Flint's a great example of how if you do not pay attention to your raw water quality, you are asking for problems. Back to algae blooms, how you don't let them get to the water treatment plant is you treat your raw water, treat your reservoir water with a copper-based algicide. So you're gonna actually put a pesticide in your water, pest being the algae, that is copper-based. The copper will go to the, I mean, it's, you just get sort of, you start going down this, you know, sort of rabbit hole. If you think you can do anything you want to your raw water, the cleaner your raw water is, the better your finished water will be. And interestingly, it's always been said, I think, John, you were the first one who ever said this to me, is that south side, which is Charlottesville, which is fed by Ragged Mountain, water tastes better than the northern side, which comes from the south. You did it. You told me that. But anyway, it's a fascinating, you know, I just, in doing this, and I'll tell you, in doing this program, just researching it, just, you know, I'm no expert, I really, really came to an incredibly renewed respect for protecting raw water and for, you know, just what the implications of not protecting your watershed is. And a renewed respect for the Ragged Mountain Project. And I will say, and that's huge for me to say, because I bought this and bought this and bought this. But I understand better why using the Mormons' water, if you can do it in a way that protects the Mormons River, is a superior product to ever using South Fork. Because South Fork's not going to get clean.
Please, everybody, come have some refreshments. Enjoy the water. Thank you all for coming.